wait! How does this happen? Let's see what has been added in the dough. Ah, that's yeast. Do you know that yeast is a living organism that breathes just like you and me? As you can see from the equation, yeast uses sugar as the food for respiration and produces ethanol and carbon dioxide. Are there any factors that affect the rate of respiration of yeast? What type of food does yeast like most for respiration? We assume that the simpler the food source is, the higher the respiration rate is. What's more, if the temperature increases, will the yeast? How about lowering the temperature? We assume that the higher the temperature is, the higher the respiration rate is. Let's investigate.
Here's how you can observe the microbial respiration of the yeast. To start with, take 10 grams of each from the following food sources: glucose, sucrose, and bread flour. Dissolve each of them in 50 ml distilled water respectively in 3 measuring cylinders. These are not for you, but for the yeast. So, here comes our main character, dried baker's yeast. Add 1 gram to each of the cylinder and stir it well. After that, place the cylinders into the water bath with 40 degrees Celsius. Repeat the above procedures at room temperature 30, 35, and 45 degrees Celsius. 5 minutes later, get the first result. Measure the rise of foam by reading the scale on the cylinder. Check whether the temperature is constant. Repeat this step every 5 minutes for an hour. Then the experiment is done.
Let's investigate how different food sources affect the respiration of yeast. From the collected data, we found that yeast loves sucrose the most, then glucose, and finally bread flour. Let's take 35 degrees Celsius as an example. For the cylinder with sucrose, the foam rose to the highest level, which was more than 100 ml. The trend of foam rise using glucose was similar to that of sucrose, while bread flour gave no significant change throughout the experiment. Here are the 5 graphs representing room temperature 30, 35, 40, and 45 degrees Celsius. Why yeast loves sucrose the most? Let me tell you. First, you have to understand the structure of different sugars, because yeast can only use simple sugar as its food source. Glucose is a monosaccharide, which is the most basic unit of carbohydrate. Sucrose is a disaccharide, which is made of 2 monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. While bread flour is a polysaccharide, which means a cluster of monosaccharides linked together. When they dissolve in water, sucrose can be broken down into its basic units, glucose and fructose. However, bread flour can be only cut into chains of monosaccharide. Therefore, we can only see significant foam rising for glucose and sucrose, but not for bread flour. On the surface of yeast cell, there are carriers that will bring monosaccharide into the cell. Different monosaccharide will have its corresponding carrier. When using glucose as the food source, only one kind of carriers does their job. But when using sucrose, there are 2 kinds of carriers bringing its basic units into the cell simultaneously. So the amount of simple sugars entering the cell for sucrose will be twice the amount of glucose. That's why sucrose becomes the most favorable food source for the yeast.
Let's move on to discuss the effects of temperature on the respiration of yeast. What about using sucrose as the sample food source? Let's see. increasing trend was observed for raw temperatures, in which 35 degrees Celsius gave the highest rate of respiration. Similar trend was observed for 40 and 45 degrees Celsius, with the rates lower than 35 degrees Celsius. You can see a sudden drop of foam height from 45 to 50 minutes due to the collapse of foam. For 30 degrees Celsius and room temperature, there was a gradually increase in the foam height throughout the experiment. Here are the three graphs representing glucose, sucrose, and bread flour. Glucose showed a similar trend for most temperatures, but at 40 degrees Celsius, the rise of foam stopped properly because of error. For bread flour, we can only observe insignificant increase for 35, 40, and 45 degrees Celsius, and even no changes for 22 and 30 degrees Celsius. What's the reason behind? It can be explained by the enzyme activity. An enzyme is a biological catalyst that speeds up the reaction by lowering the activation energy. At 22 to 30 degrees Celsius, the enzyme activity is so low that they cannot perform their function properly. When the temperature increases to 35 degrees Celsius, the enzyme activity reaches its maximum, and hence, the 35 degrees Celsius is regarded as the optimal temperature for the yeast. However, when the temperature further increases, the enzyme denatures and loses its conformation, leading to malfunction. That's why we can observe this effect from our results.
Yeast can be used for many purposes in our daily lives. For example, making wine, making beer, and baking. Yeast can consume different food sources to respire in these activities. From our experiment, sucrose is the most suitable food source, and 35 degrees Celsius is the optimal temperature for them.